It was the first time Seattle had ever been in the Super Bowl, 2005. The only reason I remember that is because I remember the loud cheers that surrounded my friend and I as we were out in the woods, unsure if we would ever be able to escape the dark forest alive. At the time, the cheers sounded more like screams. Let me explain. I was a 14-year-old girl who loved skateboarding with her best friend. We were little petite punk girls who loved to explore and skateboard. My friend was over at my house, but everyone there was transfixed by the football game. The whole neighborhood was filled with noises of people cheering on the Seahawks. It was and still is a safe and normally quiet middle to upper middle class neighborhood. It was around maybe 7 or 8 p.m., but by this point it was very dark. Not pitch black, but that deepest, darkest blue that remains until midnight. My friend had cigarettes, and we decided we were going to sneak away and skateboard to the forest, down the street to smoke and hang out in the woods. The woods were a long stretch of forest that rested in the middle of our neighborhood. On each side, steep slopes ran upward and backed into the fences of people's houses. Everyone called it a green belt, because the only entrance was at the beginning and the only exit on the other end. It felt like you were in a valley of sorts, surrounded by trees and houses far above. All the neighborhood kids explored it, and it was not uncommon to find hidden trails that led toward makeshift forts. Anyways, we arrived at the forest and walked until we found a clearing far enough away from the entrance that adults couldn't see us smoking. At the time, we didn't realize this, but most every single adult was inside watching the Super Bowl. It felt safe there, in the dark, smoking and laughing with my friend, because we could hear cheers echoing from nearby houses. We had enough cigarettes to each have our own, but we liked sharing one at a time and passing it back and forth. It made us feel connected and cool. We were sharing our second one, which was in between my fingers. I remember my friend laughing, trying to grab it from me. All of a sudden, she stopped laughing. Her eyes grew wide, and she slowly pointed behind me. "Not going to work, Jess." I thought she was trying to make me look away so she could grab the cigarette out of my hand. I could barely hear her whisper over the cheers that echoed through the forest. "I am not joking." I turned around and looked behind me, my eyes squinting in the dark. I didn't see anything until I looked at the top of the slope. The top of the slope, which ran about 50 feet up, was not that far from us. There, a man was standing, watching us. The woods were almost always empty, except for the occasional kid or teenager. Adults just used the woods as a place to dump yard clippings and old compost stuff. He was wearing all black and had on a ski cap. His hands were shoved deeply into his pockets. I remember thinking he was very tall, though I couldn't see his facial features very well. I waved at him, wondering how long he had been standing there. It struck me that he may have been there the whole time. I hoped it was a neighbor. I waited for him to yell at us for smoking, threatened to tell my parents, anything. He didn't wave back. He didn't make a sound. "Hello," I choked out. The man did not respond. His hands remained in his pockets. The dim light from a distant back porch behind him illuminated him ever so slightly. I whispered to my friend, "Jess, what do we do?" The man took his hands out of his pockets. He had gloves on, and not gardening gloves. He walked one step down the slope toward us. I could hear the sound of the leaves crunching beneath him. He stood still again, watching, waiting. More cheers erupted in the distance. The cheers that sounded so comforting less than half an hour ago now sounded foreboding. "I don't know," I whispered. "If we scream, no one would even be able to hear us. Everyone is screaming right now." Tears began to pool in her eyes. I had never seen her cry, and I had known her for 9 years by this point. I decided I had to think, and fast. Then we heard more crunching. The man took another step. I screamed, "What do you want from us?" He began to pull his ski cap down. It was then that we both realized it wasn't a ski cap, but rather a ski mask. I yelled at her to run and to grab your skateboard. At the time, I was thinking we could hit him with our skateboard if he tried anything. Probably silly, being as we each only weighed about 100 pounds or less. We got up and began running out of the woods. Like a horror movie, the man simply walked at a fast pace after us. I guess we weren't running very fast because we each were holding a skateboard. Once we got out of the woods, it was all uphill back toward my house. The man was a house length's distance or so behind us. His mask was pulled back up again. I wanted to ring a neighbor's doorbell, yell, anything, but we were so scared. Scared no one could hear us. scared that if he ran to a neighbor's house that they wouldn't be home. He ran as fast as we could up that dang hill. We were about 3 houses away from my home when the man behind us just stopped. We kept running away. We made it back to my house, breathing heavily and covered in dirt from running through the forest. What exactly had just happened? Girls, there you are. I thought my dad was angry that we had left without asking. Instead, he just sighed and said, "Well, the Seahawks just lost the Super Bowl." I grew up out in the wooded country in Illinois, on a short dead-end street 10 plus miles from a town, and there were 7 houses in the area spread out on 2.5-acre wooded lots, or larger each. There were no large wild animals. There aren't bears or similarly large animals in the region, and people didn't meander there or show up lost. Actually, lost folks or large animals wandering around never happened at all in the 20 years that I lived there. When I was a young girl in my early teens, I had a good guy friend a few years older than me who lived next door, Terry. Terry was allowed to go out with his friends much later than I was, and he would sometimes tromp over to my yard after getting home late and throw rocks from the gravel area outside of my window to chat. My bed was right next to the window. I'd open the window and we'd whisper stories and generally talk for a bit. My second-story window faced our backyard and his house was to the side. I could see his house from my window over the shrub trees and walking path to his driveway. I'd often know if he was out. The light was on over the side door entrance, or already home. Light was off. One day during the summer when my window was open, I heard a car in his driveway dropping him off. I was probably 14 years old, and it was around midnight. I heard Terry get out of a car and was talking to his friends. Soon, his friends pulled away. I softly called out, as loud as I could without waking my parents, asking Terry to stop by and chat. He didn't respond as he probably didn't hear me. Then I came up with a not-so-brilliant idea to sneak outside and scare him. I'd spent many years in the woods and learning how to blend in and be silent. As kids, we'd often sneak around and scare each other. So I silently sneaked down from the second floor and out my back garage door, which led to our backyard below my window, which led to Terry's house off the side through our gravel area, then through a well-worn path through the woods about 25 feet long. My parents had put in a gravel pit around the back of the house, probably because nothing much grew due to the shade of the oak trees. There were 14-inch oak rounds set out as an uneven stepping path in the gravel, and if you stepped off of the rounds, the crunch of gravel rocks would give you away. I picked my way expertly and silently across the log rounds facing Terry's house. My eyes got accustomed to the dark and I didn't see him. Also at that time, I heard the door of his house close and the light going off signaling he went in, likely to bed. I waited a bit as I thought I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path we'd always use. If you didn't use the path, there were wild rose and raspberry plants that had thorns and were painful to walk through if you weren't careful. So I thought it was odd that he'd be in the woods, but maybe he wanted to scare me like I was plotting to do to him. But I saw something human-sized and dark moving through the woods, slow and pausing every once in a while, like me. It was coming closer and I definitely saw it, but it was strange in that it wasn't walking directly to my window to talk. Therefore, I hunched down and waited in silence, wondering if I could startle him. I still thought it was Terry and he saw me sneak out and was trying to scare me. I watched a dark outline of a human figure moving, but then I would lose sight of it in the foliage. It seemed to be stalking slowly and listening, checking every few feet while hiding. So I whispered after losing patience one last time for Terry, but he didn't answer. I got bored of hiding and crouching, so I quietly tiptoed back to my garage door and went back inside silently, locking up as I went. I snuck back upstairs to my room above the area where I was just standing and crouching. My window was open and I definitely heard someone or something walking around the yard. I whispered again for Terry out my window but got no answer. Then I heard someone or something fall and grunt and moan pretty loudly in the window, well right below my window. It wasn't enough to wake my parents, but definitely loud enough I didn't mistake it, and it sent a shock of fear through me. If you aren't familiar with a window well, it's a semicircle hole, connected to the house, dug out about 3 or 4 feet deep, and reinforced with metal. It allows the basement window to be put in below ground level, and the hole lets some natural light in. There is no way Terry would have fallen in our window well. We have been playing hide and seek and many outdoor games for years since we were young, around the whole neighborhood. We knew everyone's window wells and house footprints, plus paths in the woods like the back of our hands. The grunt sounded humanish, and not like an animal. It also pulled itself out quietly without a lot of thrashing. That's when I realized this wasn't a fun game and something was out there, and it wasn't Terry. I tried to look outside my window as best as I could, but there was a screen on my windows to keep the bugs out, so I couldn't lean my head out of the window to see next to the wall of our house directly below me. I then heard the crunch of rocks as whatever it was stepping in the noisy gravel. Again, Terry would know where the log rounds were and would not step in the gravel. He knew my parents were pretty strict and he was good at being quiet as I was. Whatever it was stopped and I held my breath. I pretty much sat there with my face pressed against the screen, 2 stories up, for probably a half hour. It seemed like an hour, but I'm sure I didn't have patience back then to wait that long. I never heard him or her leave, but I grew tired and eventually fell asleep on my bed that was next to my window. There are a few things I'm certain of. It wasn't Terry. I asked him later and he said he went to bed that night when he got home. He also had no reason to lie. I'm pretty sure it wasn't one of our neighbors, and I can't think of any reason a person would be there. We had a few neighbors and only 2 other houses out of 7 had kids. Again, these 7 houses were spread out at least 2.5 acres per home. There weren't any big animals in the area. We only had some deer around, but they were hunted and didn't come close to homes. Plus our dog always scared them away. Years ago, when I was still a teenager, my friend Justin and I would often go longboarding at night, as my friends and I were quite the night owls. We loved the freedom of almost never seeing another soul on the roads or the paths we frequented. Even when using main roads, it would be very rare to see a car out so late in such a rural area, and you could see and hear them coming from very far away due to their headlights, and the noise of the vehicle disrupting the peaceful silence of the night. We were really into it at the time, and would often ride our boards for miles and miles, sometimes not arriving home until the sun was up. One particular night, we decided to go for a ride miles away from our usual back roads to take one of our favorite hidden routes. It began with a narrow, paved path that was the only piece of land separating 2 sides of a long lake. It would often sink under due to rain, and we wanted to seize the opportunity to use it before it rained and went underwater again. It was roughly 2 miles long and was extremely relaxing to ride through due to the scenery. After making it to the end of the lake, we decided to continue moving and turn into a very close path that leads directly into a densely wooded wilderness preservation. As we came up to the first hill, we looked down at the bottom into the blackness. We both noticed what appeared to be a tiny moving ball of dim light down there. It moved so strangely, and it was extremely difficult to make out what it was. Rather than shine our flashlight down, we curiously watched it for a few moments, whispering to each other about what it could possibly be. All at once, that small light turned into multiple blinding lights and extremely loud revving sounds, overwhelming our senses that become accustomed to the dark and silence. Acting purely on fear, we instantly turned around and ran as fast as we could, hearing yelling and revving gang behind us. By sheer luck, we managed to run off the path into a very dark, very overgrown hole in the side of a hill, overlooking where we had just come from. We decided to hide in the natural dugout of this hill, hoping the plants and darkness would be enough to protect us from whatever was happening out there. We watched our pursuers ride up to where we had originally been standing. There were 4 men, 2 on 4-wheelers, and 2 on full-size motorcycles. They were yelling at each other about something, but we couldn't make out what they were saying due to the distance we had covered. We felt safe enough to whisper very softly to each other and speculated who these people could be. Our first thought was that they might be park rangers of some kind, although we had never seen one here in the many times we had been through, and honestly, we doubted that this county had the budget or even the desire to have anyone patrol the deep woods at night. Besides that, these men were on vehicles entirely inappropriate for the paved bike trails. They were very angry about something. They called out to us for a while, yelling things like, "We know you're out there. We can see you. Come out." We stayed silent and decided to call their bluff instead of running. Eventually, we clearly heard one of the men yell, "Find them now," and smash a bottle. That had erased any hope we had that these were just park rangers. We watched them split up, each of them going a different way down the series of paths on their vehicles, including the path we came from. It took us what felt like ages to even move. We were frozen in terror inside that dugout, watching the lights from the vehicles travel through the woods and paths, one of them already coming full circle and passing the point he started from. I thought about calling for help, but I was too afraid to open my phone. in fear that even the smallest amount of light would give away our location. After waiting for the lights of the vehicles to reach their farthest distance yet, we finally summoned the nerve to get up and try to run somewhere far enough from these people to safely make a call. We ran as hard and fast as we could through the woods. Since their headlights gave away their location on these paths, we would hide again whenever we felt they were getting too close. Our available hiding spots were getting progressively worse as the woods became less dense, and the fear I felt waiting for one of them to drive past us, while basically only being covered in leaves and plants, may still be unmatched to this day. Finally, we emerged from the woods and onto the intersection of two main roads, far from where we started. We ducked down in the ditch to call for help. When I opened my phone, I noticed I had recent missed calls from one of our other friends, Connor. We were supposed to meet up with long after our longboard excursion. I called him and frantically asked where he was. Luck was with us again. He hadn't given up on our plans despite us ignoring him and was only a few miles away, already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of the two streets we were near the corner of and explained that we needed to be picked up right away. He agreed to speed over to us while Justin and I waited in hiding. Thankfully, Connor arrived before any of those men did. We bolted into the back seats of his car, yelling for him to get out of there, and he took off. Relief doesn't begin to describe what I was feeling, being safely driven home after everything I had just experienced. After explaining everything that happened to Connor, we ended up just moving on with our night and decided not to call the police. We figured they would have been gone by the time any officer made it out there, that we would only be putting ourselves at risk by admitting to breaking the law by taking those paths so late at night. I still have no idea what happened or who those people were. I've been told all kinds of theories from friends and family that have heard this story. Some think we walked right up to a huge drug deal. Justin and I later admitted to each other that when the revving started and we couldn't see, our minds both went straight to chainsaw-wielding horror movie serial killer. So I suppose it could have been much worse. Frustratingly enough, whatever those men thought we saw that made them want to catch us so badly, we never actually saw. We'll never really know, I suppose. I'm currently a 31-year-old female. In 1989, my parents divorced, and by 1990, my father had moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and married my now stepmother. My brother and I would spend the whole summer with him and his new wife, and we're ecstatic to be able to run around in the woods, chase rabbits, and just genuinely enjoy the sunshine and adventures that come from a lack of supervision while the parents were at work. They lived in South County in a cheap but seemingly okay apartment complex. Their building was at the very back, next to a second apartment building that was catty-corner in location. To the south was a small ravine surrounded by trees and yet another separate complex. To the north, just behind the back door of Dad's building, was a small wooded area that stretched along the back half of the complex. My brother and I spent hours that first week exploring these woods with our newfound friend, Paul, who lived at the complex with his mother, and the building catty-corner to ours. We would play tag, build forts out of scavenged wood, and using items we found in my dad's toolbox to aid us in the apparently long-standing prank war between us and the kids from the other apartment complex. One day, while we were scouting for the best place to build, we came across what can only be described as a hastily built bum shack. There were rotting pieces of wood nailed together, with a torn blue tarp draped over the top of it, to form a sort of tent. There were signs that a small fire had been built just outside the tent, which piqued our curiosity even more. We were stupidly brave children, so I acted as lookout while my brother and Paul scoped out the inside. Within the tent, they found a pile of mildewed clothing, a stained pillow, a hammer, a flashlight, a rusty pot, and trash from food items. At first we thought it was the single most exciting find of the summer. As I stood there, I began to feel my skin crawl in that familiar way that it does when someone is watching you. I cautioned the boys that maybe we should move on, and they called me a sissy. I was sick to my stomach at that point, and felt a dire need to remove myself from the area. I finally convinced them to leave the tent alone, by reminding them that we had to work on our next prank idea for the kids in the other complex, and we rushed off to conduct our shenanigans. The tent was forgotten for the rest of the day, as there were so many other adventures that needed our attention, such as Nintendo, prank wars, and raiding fridges. We were always due home at dark, so we said our goodbyes to Paul and headed next door for dinner. The evening continued as per normal, with my dad and stepmom relinquishing the TV to us kids so they could head to bed. They warned us not to stay up too late. My brother and I sat alone in the living room, which had a large window on the north wall, next to the couch that I slept on. The window was open and a light summer breeze was wafting in. We randomly heard footsteps out back, but it was the favored place for tenants who were smokers, including our parents, so we thought nothing of it. We continued to melt our minds with television, and then decided that we wanted something to snack on, so I went into the kitchen to grab the Cheez-Its and a soda for each of us. As I turned the corner from the kitchen to walk back into the living room, my blood ran cold. There was a tall, dark shape standing on the edge of the woods, looking right into the window at me. At first I stopped, but some survival instinct kicked in, and I looked to my right to ensure that the front door was locked and walked as calmly as I could to where my brother was sitting on the floor. I sat down and said in a whisper, "Calvin, remember that shack we found today? I think the man who made it is right outside the window, and he's watching us. Do not say a word. Do not act like you know he is there. Act normal. I will sneak around and close the windows. We'll explain things to Dad in the morning." My brother's eyes bugged out of his head, but then he nodded. My mother's home was full of violence, and we had learned to depend on each other for survival, so he trusted that I would keep us safe. I crawled on my belly to the other rooms to close the windows, and then with a deep breath and a rush of adrenaline, slid the living room window closed from the side, so that I could not be seen. My brother and I were not able to focus on television from that point, and formulated the genius idea of pretending to go to bed. As the older sister and protector, it was my job to tend to turning off the lights once my brother was securely under the blanket on the couch, located on the same wall as the front door. We were afraid of the dark, but on this night, we agreed to turn off all of the lights so that we could not be seen. As I walked to my couch to lie down, I could still see the man standing there. I prayed silently that he could no longer see me and felt relief as I ducked underneath the window and pulled the blanket over me. I was freaked out by the staring and the stillness. My adrenaline was pulsing full force, and I dreamed up a million ways to protect us if he somehow got inside. It must have tapered off at some point, because I woke up a few hours later to my brother asking if it was safe to get up from the couch. I told him to wait and cautiously peeked up from the bottom edge of the window. I saw only trees and told my brother that it was clear. We both rushed to my dad's room to tell him what had happened. He was getting ready for work and mostly brushed off the story, but told us to stay the hell out of those woods, and then left for the day, followed by our stepmother a few minutes later. My brother and I tried to convince ourselves that Dad was right. It was nothing serious. Neither of us were convinced, but if Dad wasn't worried, we shouldn't be, right? Still, we were cautious. We had no key and usually left the apartment unlocked, as we ran in and out each day. On this day, we chose not to take chances and called Paul, detailing the events and a stealth plan to get him to our apartment safely. Once Paul got there, we spent the day keeping a lookout through the living room window. There was not 1 minute that it was not monitored, though we did not see the man again. Paul's mom got home around 4, and she came to our apartment looking for him. He refused to leave and told her what had happened. She asked us if we had told our dad and seemed frustrated at his reaction. She dragged Paul home and made us promise to lock the door immediately behind her. About 30 minutes later, we saw 2 cop cars pull up outside of our building. We called Paul and found out that his mom had decided to call the police about the man in the woods, fearing for her son's safety. We felt much braver with the cops there, so we all 3 met outside to watch the happenings. The cops had ventured into the woods, and one who stayed behind at the cars began asking us questions and radioed some of our responses to the other cops. After about 10 minutes, 3 law enforcement officers came walking out of the tree line, 2 of them holding the arms of a scraggly-looking dude who kept his head down. My brother grabbed my hand, and I held it tightly as the guy looked up and glared at us. I told my brother that we would be safe, that the cops would take him to jail now. I think I was trying to convince myself too. All I know is that I was nervous, though relieved that they had found him, and the knife he had been carrying on his person. When they held that up, I almost pissed myself, and realized that we had been incredibly stupid, but lucky.